Hello, in this video you'll learn how to use Redis in .NET 10, a simple caching system. Essentially, you've probably heard what it is and what it does, but basically speaking, it's just a sort of faster database. We call it caching, but essentially you sort of, usually the way I use it, at least, of course, there's quite a few use cases for it, but if you have a heavier query, you just cache it. So essentially you recognize that this is the query, and you, instead of sort of going through your SQL Server or PostgreSQL database, you just recognize the same result for the same query and you return the thing. Now you can do it with hashes, and you can do other arrangements, not just the database, but this is probably sort of the more common ways to actually use it. Now, in terms of setup, first of all, we need to set up the actual Redis database as such arrangement, and then we will need to install some NuGet packages. Now, for the actual Redis, you can easily do that on Docker. Here is an example of a little command to install. It will pull the image and it will just have this sort of arrangement. Now, there are options you can choose and whatnot, but basically just remember that in production you would want to secure that port with some firewall arrangements, so only your application can actually access it. There's other ways to kind of do that, but that's probably the easiest and usually the most common way, just to put a firewall behind that, just as you should be doing with your databases. So the same exact thing in terms of security. Now, if we go to the actual code, the project example here, a very simple example, just the minimal APIs, .NET 10, nothing too difficult. We have an in-memory database, but of course in real world you would use probably something like SQL Server or something of that nature. We just kind of emulate the whole arrangement, but in order to start using it, you'll need this StackExchange.Redis, the NuGet package, and that's it. That's all you need. Of course, for handling some perhaps file arrangements, more fancier JSON things, there are many additional libraries that you can use to actually set up the data for it. But let's just go to the setup. We have JSON, because we'll do a bit of JSON. We have Redis, and then just the sort of simple, straightforward, minimal API arrangement with a couple of routes here. To set it up, similar to a database, any database really, we have a connection string. We get that from the connection strings in app settings. Again, relatively straightforward thing, but if we go to the actual app settings for this example, you can see the connection string is Redis, but essentially there's no actual users and things of that nature. We just point to that instance on the Docker, and that's all that there is. And then we need to add singleton, and we are using IConnectionMultiplexer. So kind of an unrelated perhaps word. It's not register Redis, something like that. But no, we use IConnectionMultiplexer, and you'll see we will set up the database from that. We have ConnectionMultiplexer connect, and we are using the string, the connection string for it. Now, the actual usage, let's look at a couple of very basic and very straightforward example, and then we'll get something more real world. Here we have a key gets passed, and we have some body that we will save, right? So it might be a search query, it might be something else, doesn't really matter. But we use StringSetAsync. Now, if we look quickly, you can add different values as well, and you can combine values, but this perhaps for another video. Usually the way you would use it is you're just using StringSetAsync, and your data can easily be JSON, and it would probably be JSON, whether it's for query or the actual result. But then the key could be hashed as well, so if you have a very, very massive query and obviously you don't want to write in the whole JSON as key, that's gonna get heavy real quick. You might want to just hash the data depending on your arrangement. So just kind of something to calculate and think about. Once we get to the other example, we'll kind of talk about that. But essentially, use StringSetAsync. You have key, you have value, and you also have the lifetime of the cache item, essentially. So here we will save it for 5 minutes. Now, if you have a very heavy database with sort of often changing data, you might only do that for 30 seconds, for example. Now, it may still be time saving, but the data at some point will have to change, because remember, once we get to the queries, you have your query, you have your data. Now, if the database changes, of course, it's not going to reflect the database changes. So again, something to consider. Is it a long-term thing? How much of that sort of change can you allow not to happen in that certain period of time? So it's something, again, important to remember. And it will be a case-by-case basis. There's no sort of constant for it. But essentially, to use this, we use Redis, which is injected right here from IConnectionMultiplexer. We get database. Now we can use set and get from that. And then we have key and value. The whole point of that is a simple key and value storage. Now, what the key is and what the value is, it's up to you to determine. And then, of course, there's a time constraint on how long it will stay there. And that's kind of the most important thing, really, especially when dealing just a sort of simple query caching. If you do need to update the database, well, then you probably don't want it to leave for too long. Or perhaps it would work as well, depending on some specific time of day or things of that nature. So you can also do those things. Now, as far as reading it, even more simple rather, we have the key. We only need the key. Of course, in the real world, it wouldn't come from the actual API call, but it would be probably found somewhere as query. We'll take a look at one of those examples. And then we have Redis. We have Redis get database, get string, or StringGetAsync rather, using a string, and then we'll have that value. The value is something called a Redis value, which usually will be string. There are, if we just take a quick look here, a few options. Now you can copy it to just a byte array, so it could actually be not necessarily saved as string, but as a byte array as well, which can be useful for certain sort of arrangements. But again, this is supposed to be lightweight, so you probably don't want to save files necessarily, unless that sort of arrangement is needed. But just remember, this is perhaps not exactly the technology for it. So there are some options in the Redis value, but essentially the most useful thing is just this is null or empty, and then actually getting the value to string, or copy to if you have some kind of a byte arrangement, perhaps some kind of a hashed string there, so you can just get directly the bytes instead of going from the string. Now, let's look at a more complex example, and this is where sort of you would use it. So we get a queue, the query, right? Let's say for a product search. Let's go down a bit. We just have a little product repository with some pre-inserted stuff. Nothing too interesting. The search essentially just retrieves the products based on the query. So, of course, we handle if the search is null, that's okay, that's a regular thing. Then what we do is, and again, this is where it's sort of the complexity might come in. Now, you may just hash the thing so you have that unique but also possibly matching query. So if you have the same query, you have the same, even a very lightweight hashing arrangement might work for this as a simple key. So you just hash it, and there are videos on this channel you can watch on how to actually do that in C#. So you have that, but in this case we have sort of key naming system. So the cache key will be products search and whatever the actual query is. Now, The reason I mention hashing and one of those arrangements perhaps, because as you can imagine with a more perhaps complex query, this would become massive and it might have problems, it may not be parsed correctly and all those things. So it's something to consider because this could essentially be, say, 1000 characters, the actual query. So again, important to remember. But the way in general we do this, we have a cache, we have a cache key, okay? And then we see if it is cached or not, but basically we just get the same Redis value as we looked previously. So if we don't get it, well, then it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, then we go to the actual search, right? Then we serialize the search result very quickly, which will actually return in the results right here in the API. So we serialize it for return, and also we put it in the cache. So we use a new, or the same rather, cache key that was not found before. We put the JSON result payload, and then from minutes we add a bit of time. Now, something to remember, of course, if you restart, if you update the structure of the return result, it may not actually work. So whenever you do that, you should also completely restart and reset the Redis arrangement, because you just need to restart it, and it's all held in certain sort of arrangement. So essentially you will need to purge it because the structure will be different, and that can cause quite a few problems. Of course, if you have for a minute, then just test it 5 minutes from then, and it should probably be okay. But something to remember as well. And as for the cached products right here, we just have the JSON deserializer, serializer, and then deserializer, and then we take the cached and we explicitly say that it is actually the actual value, right? That is a string. So then we just return the cache products. Now, again, if you want to learn more about minimal APIs, there are a couple of previous videos on this channel of great explanations getting started with minimal APIs in general, and then we cover validation quite in depth as well. And with that said, we will conclude this video.